I won't be stepping onto that stage with you." Those were the last words my father said before hanging up. 6 words. 6 words delivered 3 days before the Army pinned a Purple Heart to my uniform. For a long moment, I just stared at the bottle of black shoe polish sitting open beside my combat boots. The smell of wax and solvent filled my apartment. My right hand stopped moving. The brush froze halfway across the leather. Then the line went dead. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my phone across the room. I've lived through mortar attacks. You learn very quickly that panic only makes things worse. So I pressed the speaker button. The silence afterwards somehow hurt more than the conversation itself. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. "Mom?" I answered. She didn't bother saying hello. "Your father told you already." I stayed quiet. "It's only a medal, Sarah." She sounded irritated, as if we were discussing a delayed dinner reservation. "Go receive it yourself. Don't make everyone uncomfortable." I finally spoke. "Uncomfortable?" She sighed. "You know Chloe has Julian's campaign fundraiser that weekend. The press will be everywhere. If newspapers start running photographs of you in uniform instead of Chloe," she paused, "it creates unnecessary attention." My fingers tightened around the phone. Attention because I was shot? Another sigh. The scar. Her voice became colder. "It isn't exactly something cameras need to focus on." I closed my eyes. The thick scar stretching across my right forearm suddenly felt heavier than it ever had in Iraq. "It's bad optics." 3 words. Apparently, the bullet that nearly tore my arm apart had become a public relations problem. "I hope one day," I said quietly, "you understand what you're asking me." She never answered. The call ended. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror. My Army service uniform hung neatly from the closet door. Every ribbon sat perfectly aligned. Every brass button reflected the morning light. The Purple Heart wasn't there yet. In 3 days, it would be. If I walked onto that stage alone. My eyes drifted toward the scar on my arm. Years had passed. The skin had healed. Mostly. Some nights the nerves still burned hard enough to wake me at 3 in the morning. Funny. The people who caused the deepest pain had never been anywhere near the battlefield. My name is Sarah Marsh. I'm 32 years old. I'm a combat engineer in the United States Army. Most people assume engineers spend their careers behind desks. Combat engineers don't. We clear explosives, build bridges under fire, open roads everyone else is too afraid to drive. Sometimes, we become the reason other soldiers make it home alive. That medal wasn't awarded because I was lucky. It existed because another soldier was still alive. I would gladly trade it away if it meant none of us ever had to bleed for it. My family never understood any of that. To them, military service was an embarrassing detour. My older sister Chloe was the success story. Perfect grades, perfect clothes, perfect smile. She eventually married Julian Carter, a rising politician who measured every human interaction by how it looked in tomorrow's headlines. Somewhere along the way, my parents started doing the same. Everything became image, status, connections, appearances. Honor never entered the conversation. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself black coffee. The apartment was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming. Across the room sat an old wooden shelf. Most people would have noticed the framed certificates, the commendation ribbons, the photographs. My eyes went somewhere else, to a small piece of splintered plywood. Ugly, crooked, weathered. Anyone else would have thrown it away years ago. I never could, because that broken piece of wood had once been something much larger, something that changed my life long before the army ever did. I reached over and picked it up. The rough edge scraped gently across my thumb. The feeling instantly pulled me backward. Not to Iraq, not to Afghanistan. Connecticut. I was 14 years old, standing alone in my parents' backyard with bleeding hands and a head full of dreams. Back then, Arthur Marsh was one of the most respected banking executives in the state. People practically stood up straighter when my father entered a room. He loved introducing Chloe. "This one," he'd proudly tell his colleagues, "she's going places." Then he'd smile, like he'd personally built her himself. I never got introductions. I got chores, comparisons, or silence. I wasn't interested in debate clubs or private school politics anyway. I loved building things. Broken bicycles, old lawnmowers, anything with bolts. Anything people said couldn't be fixed. While Chloe practiced speeches, I spent weekends digging through construction dumpsters looking for scrap lumber. Most of it was warped. Some of it was rotten. I brought every usable piece home anyway. Over 3 weeks, I built a 7-foot defensive structure in our backyard. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't supposed to be. It was designed to survive. The county engineering competition accepted projects from every high school in the region. Most students arrived with polished models. Mine barely fit through the gym doors. Teachers stared. Judges walked around at 3 separate times. Then they started asking questions about load distribution, structural support, material strength. For 2 hours, I answered every one. At the end of the afternoon, they handed me first place. I remember staring down at the heavy brass trophy in my hands. I'd never won anything before. Not anything that mattered. Parents rushed onto the gym floor, hugging their kids. Cameras flashed. Laughter echoed across the bleachers. I waited. 5 minutes, 10, 30. Eventually, the janitors started folding up chairs, one by one. The gym emptied. 40 minutes after the ceremony ended, the doors finally opened. Dad walked inside, still wearing his expensive business suit, still looking at his phone. He barely glanced up. "You win?" I nodded. He looked at the trophy. "Good." Then he slipped his phone into his pocket. "Hurry up. Chloe's waiting." "We're already late for dinner." That was it. No hug, no congratulations. No asking about the project, nothing. That evening, the family celebrated Chloe advancing to another debate competition. My trophy stayed inside the trunk of Dad's car. No one even remembered to bring it inside. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered into the kitchen for water. Voices drifted through the open patio door. Mom and Dad were outside. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Then I heard Mom say something that stopped me cold. "That thing has to go." Dad asked, "What thing?" "Sarah's wooden bunker. It makes the backyard look awful." I stood perfectly still. She continued, "It looks like trailer park junk. I don't want guests seeing it." Silence. I waited for Dad to defend me. Instead, I heard ice clink softly inside his drink. I'll have someone tear it down tomorrow. Just like that. 3 weeks of work. My first real accomplishment. Gone. Because it didn't match the landscaping. I never walked outside. I never interrupted them. Instead, I slipped quietly into the bunker. Moonlight leaked through tiny gaps between the wooden boards. I sat alone on the dirt floor. My thumb still had a long splinter buried deep beneath the skin from finishing the project. I looked at it for a long time. Then, instead of pulling it out, I pushed it in even farther. The sharp pain shot straight through my hand. For some reason, that hurt less than realizing I'd never mattered inside that house. That night, I made a promise to myself. If my own family refused to see me, one day, I'd build a life so strong, I wouldn't need their approval anymore. I had no idea how difficult keeping that promise would become, or that 18 years later, the very people who ignored that little wooden bunker would refuse to stand beside me while I received one of the Army's highest honors. And they still didn't know. Someone else had already decided to take their place. The next morning, the bunker was gone. Not damaged, not partially dismantled. Gone. I walked into the backyard before school, still wearing yesterday's work gloves in my jacket pocket. The rectangle of dirt where it had stood looked almost untouched. Fresh sod had already been rolled over the ground. By noon, no one would have believed anything had ever been there. It was the first lesson my parents ever taught me about appearances. If something threatened the image, erase it. I never asked what happened. There wasn't any point. Dad left early for work. Mom spent the morning directing landscapers like a general commanding troops. Neither of them mentioned the competition. Neither mentioned the trophy. That afternoon, I carried the brass cup upstairs and slid it into the back of my bedroom closet. Not because I wasn't proud of it, because I was tired of looking at something that reminded me no one else was. The years passed. Some people peak in high school. I simply survived it. Chloe collected awards. I rebuilt old engines. She attended networking dinners. I worked weekends at a salvage yard. By 17, I could rebuild a transmission faster than most licensed mechanics. Dad called it wasting potential. The shop owner called it talent. Funny how two people can look at the same pair of hands and see completely different futures. Graduation arrived in late May. For once, I thought maybe the day would belong to me. Mom had mentioned inviting relatives for a backyard barbecue. Dad even asked what kind of cake I wanted. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then Chloe came home from Washington. She walked through the front door carrying a diamond ring the size of a marble. I'm engaged. Everything changed before dinner. The barbecue disappeared. The guest list tripled. The celebration moved from our backyard to the private dining room of one of the most expensive steakhouses in Hartford. Officially, it was still supposed to celebrate my graduation. Unofficially, it became Chloe's engagement party. No one even pretended otherwise. The restaurant glittered with crystal chandeliers. Politicians, lawyers, bank executives, campaign donors. People shook Julian's hand as though he'd already been elected to office. Every few minutes, someone lifted a champagne glass. To the happy couple, another toast, then another. I sat near the end of the longest table, still wearing my blue graduation gown because I'd come straight from the ceremony. Nobody asked to see my diploma. Nobody asked where I planned to go next. One woman actually leaned toward me halfway through dinner. She smiled politely. And whose son are you? I almost laughed. My parents? She blinked, confused, then turned back toward Chloe before I finished cutting my steak. Dad gave a speech. It lasted almost 5 minutes. He talked about ambition, leadership, vision. He praised Julian's future. He praised Chloe's intelligence. Then he raised his glass. Here's to building a remarkable life together. Everyone applauded. My graduation cap sat forgotten beside my chair. I quietly reached over, picked it up, and rested it on my lap. No one noticed. By the time dessert arrived, I'd accepted something. You can't compete with someone who's always been chosen before you even enter the room. 2 weeks later, a white envelope arrived. United States Army, Combat Engineer Branch. I already knew what it contained. I'd applied months earlier. I carried it into the kitchen. Mom sat at the island, scrolling through wedding venues on her tablet. I placed the envelope beside her coffee. She looked at the Army seal. Her smile disappeared. What is this? My acceptance papers. She opened the first page, read exactly 3 lines, then set it back down as though it were contaminated. You can't be serious. I am. You graduated with honors. I know. You could work anywhere. I know. And instead, she looked at me with genuine disbelief. You're choosing to dig trenches? I almost smiled. Combat engineers do far more than that, but correcting her wouldn't change anything. Dad walked in just then. Mom slid the papers toward him. He skimmed the page. His reaction wasn't angry. It was worse. Disappointed. As long as you understand, he said carefully, this isn't the future we imagined for you. I looked at both of them. When have either of you ever imagined a future for me? Neither answered. That night, I packed my first military duffel bag. There wasn't much to take. A few clothes, some tools, the old brass trophy, and one small piece of splintered wood, the only thing left from the bunker. I slipped it into the bottom of the bag, not because it was valuable, because it reminded me why I was leaving. To pay for everything the Army wouldn't issue immediately, I worked nights washing dishes at a roadside diner. 8 hours every shift. Hot water, grease, soap, broken fingernails. The cooks teased me constantly. You sure you want the military? One asked. You could stay here forever. I laughed. If I stay here forever, I'll never know what I'm capable of. The old cook named Frank looked at me for a second, then nodded. That's the right answer. The morning I left for basic training, the house was strangely quiet. No balloons, no photographs, no goodbye breakfast. Dad had already gone to work. Mom left a note on the refrigerator. Good luck. Nothing else. No signature. No hug. No drive to the airport. Just 2 words written with a blue marker. A taxi pulled into the driveway. The driver loaded my duffel into the trunk. I looked back once. The curtains never moved. No one came to the window. No one waved. As the taxi pulled away, I realized something. I wasn't heartbroken. That feeling had worn out years earlier. What I felt instead was relief. Because for the first time in my life, no one inside that house got to decide who I was becoming. Basic training nearly killed me. Combat engineer school tried even harder. Long marches, explosives, obstacle courses, sleep deprivation, blisters that bled through my boots. And somehow, I'd never been happier. For the first time, nobody cared where I came from. Nobody asked what neighborhood I grew up in. Nobody compared me to Chloe. The only thing that mattered was whether I carried my own weight. And I did. Every single day. The Army didn't give me a perfect life. It gave me something better. A chance to earn my place. I thought that would finally be enough. I believed putting on the uniform meant leaving the Marsh family behind forever. I was wrong. Because years later, when my sister discovered that my service might interfere with her husband's political future, she found a way to reach across an ocean and remind me exactly where she believed I belonged. The first few years passed faster than I expected. Basic training became advanced training. Advanced training became deployments. Before long, the Army stopped feeling like a career. It became home. Not because it was easy, because everyone around me understood something my family never had. Respect wasn't inherited. It was earned. Combat engineers don't spend much time in the spotlight. If we're doing our job correctly, nobody notices us. They simply drive across the bridge we built, walk down the road we cleared, or make it home because the explosive buried beneath that road never had a chance to detonate. That was enough for me. Recognition had never been why I enlisted. Ironically, recognition was exactly what caused trouble back home. By then, Chloe had married Julian Carter. His political career was taking off. Campaign fundraisers, television interviews, magazine profiles. Everything they did revolved around one thing: image. Every family photograph looked rehearsed. Every smile looked practiced. Even Christmas cards seemed professionally directed. I watched most of it from overseas, and honestly, I preferred being thousands of miles away. Then, one afternoon in Afghanistan, a local newspaper back in Connecticut published a short article about our engineering unit. Nothing dramatic, just a story about soldiers repairing damaged roads and clearing explosives for humanitarian convoys. There was one photograph. I happened to be standing in the front, covered in dust, holding my helmet, smiling. I almost forgot about it. Chloe didn't. The satellite phone rang the following evening. Dad. I answered while sitting outside a temporary operations tent. The desert wind carried sand across the concrete barrier surrounding the base. You need to call that newspaper. No greeting, no asking how I was doing, just instructions. Why? Chloe's upset. I almost laughed. About what? People keep sending her the article. So? It isn't helping Julian. I waited. Dad lowered his voice. They're trying to present a calmer family image. They don't want military stories connected to the campaign. I stared out across the desert. You want me to ask them to remove the article? It would make everyone's life easier. My life? No, he admitted quietly. Chloe's. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting inside me for years. If I hadn't survived over here, would that have been better for the campaign too? The silence lasted so long. I checked to make sure the line hadn't disconnected. Then Dad sighed. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I closed my eyes. "I'm hanging up now. Sarah." Click. That conversation stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Not because it hurt, because it confirmed something. I would always be expected to become smaller whenever Chloe needed more room. A few months later, everything changed. Our unit had been assigned to help secure a temporary bridge crossing after heavy fighting. It wasn't unusual. The danger came with the job. We were halfway across when the first shots rang out. The world compressed into noise, radio traffic, engines, dust. Someone shouted for a medic, then another explosion. I remember turning. One of our medics had gone down near the far side of the bridge. Without thinking, I ran. The first few yards felt strangely quiet. Then came the impact. It wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic slow motion, just an explosion of pressure tearing through my right arm. I hit the ground hard enough to knock the air from my lungs. For a second, I couldn't feel anything. Then the pain arrived all at once. Hot, sharp, blinding. Someone grabbed the back of my vest. "Stay with me," I tried to answer. Only blood came out with the words. The sound of helicopter blades grew louder overhead. A Black Hawk dropped toward the landing zone through a cloud of dust. A flight medic sprinted toward me. He didn't hesitate, didn't stare at the wound, didn't waste a second. He grabbed my vest, dragged me toward the helicopter, and shouted over the engines. "I've got you." That was the first time I met Chief Warrant Officer David Vance. At the time, neither of us knew he'd just changed my life. The surgeons saved my arm. Barely. The bullet shattered muscle, damaged nerves, left a scar that stretched almost from my wrist to my elbow. Physical therapy became my new deployment. Every movement hurt. Simple tasks took twice as long. Holding a coffee mug, buttoning a shirt, turning a wrench. Some days, opening a jar felt harder than clearing a minefield. David checked on me almost every week. Sometimes we'd eat lunch. Sometimes we'd sit in silence. He never treated me like someone broken. One afternoon, he knocked on my apartment door. "Want to take a drive?" "Where?" "You'll see." 40 minutes later, we pulled into an old woodworking shop outside town. The building wasn't much to look at. Corrugated steel walls, weathered sign, stacks of lumber piled outside beneath a tin awning. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. Fresh cedar, pine, sawdust, machine oil. It reminded me of something. Home. Not my parents' house. The little bunker I'd built all those years ago. David smiled. "I thought you'd like this place." A table saw shut off somewhere in the back. An older man walked toward us, wiping wood shavings from his hands. He was broad-shouldered, gray-haired, built like he'd spent a lifetime lifting things heavier than himself. "This is my dad," David said. "Thomas Vance, retired Command Sergeant Major." Thomas looked directly at me. Not at the scar, not at my rank. At me. He reached out his rough hand. "You must be Sarah." "Yes, Sergeant Major." He shook his head. "Thomas." Then he pointed toward a stack of unfinished cedar boards. "You know how to sand wood?" "I used to." "Good." He tossed me a sanding block. "Then stop standing around." That simple. No sympathy, no awkward questions, no pity. Just work. For the next several weeks, I kept coming back. Some days we barely spoke. We built shelves, benches, shadow boxes for retiring veterans, American flags carved from reclaimed wood. The work steadied my hands. More importantly, it steadied my mind. One afternoon, my injured arm cramped without warning. A heavy wooden mallet slipped from my fingers and crashed onto the concrete floor. I cursed under my breath. Thomas walked over. Without saying anything, he gently took hold of my scarred forearm. He examined the twisted skin for a moment, then looked me straight in the eye. "You still think this scar makes you weaker?" I shrugged. "Some people do." He nodded slowly. "They're wrong." His thumb rested lightly against the damaged tissue. "This scar tells me exactly where you refused to quit." I felt my throat tighten. No one had ever spoken about it like that before. Not once. He squeezed my shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Sarah." 4 simple words. I'd spent 32 years waiting to hear them, and they finally came. From a man who didn't share a single drop of my blood. At that moment, I realized something that would change the rest of my life. Sometimes, the family you earn arrives long before the family you were born into ever learns your worth. I didn't know it yet, but only a few weeks later, Thomas Vance would make a decision that would leave my parents sitting in stunned silence in the back row of my Purple Heart ceremony. 3 weeks later, an official envelope from the Department of the Army arrived in my mailbox. I already knew what it contained before I opened it. Still, my hands trembled. I unfolded the letter. "Read it once. Then read it again." The Purple Heart had been approved. For a long moment, I simply sat on the edge of my bed staring at the page. Not because I was proud, because I remembered exactly what it had cost. The bridge, the medic, the bullet, the helicopter, the months learning how to use my arm again. No medal could ever balance that equation. David came over that evening. He found me sitting at the kitchen table. The letter rested between 2 untouched mugs of coffee. He picked it up, read the first paragraph, then smiled. "You earned it." I survived. You earned it. There was a difference. He knew it. So did I. "The ceremony's next month." He nodded. "You inviting your family?" I hesitated. They deserved the chance. David didn't argue. He simply leaned back. "Sometimes people surprise you." I hope you're right. Deep down, I already knew he wasn't. The next afternoon, I called Connecticut. Dad answered after the 3rd ring. "Sarah, the Army approved the Purple Heart." Silence. Not shocked silence, not emotional silence, just silence. Finally, he cleared his throat. "When's the ceremony?" I told him. "I'll check the calendar." Those 4 words landed harder than I expected. Not, "We'll be there," just, "I'll check the calendar." Before I could answer, Mom's voice floated through the phone. "Arthur, give me that!" The receiver changed hands. "Sarah?" She sounded strangely interested. "Who'll be attending?" "What do you mean?" "The ceremony." "Any important guests?" I frowned. "I don't know. Members of Congress?" The governor? Military leadership? I honestly haven't looked. Another pause. Then, what about television? That was her first real question. Not, are you okay? Not, does your arm still hurt? Just, would there be cameras? Why does that matter? It matters because Julian is considering another campaign. Her tone sharpened. If there are photographers there, we need to know. Need. Interesting choice of word. I looked down at the scar stretching across my arm. So, if nobody important attends, you won't? She ignored the question. Call us when you know. The line disconnected. I sat there, holding a dead phone. For some reason, that conversation hurt more than the battlefield ever had. A week passed, then another. No one called. No one asked how preparations were going. No one asked if I needed anything. Until 3 days before the ceremony, Dad finally called. I've been thinking. His voice sounded nervous. I don't think your mother and I should attend. I didn't answer. He rushed to fill the silence. Chloe's concerned. Concerned? Julian has an important fundraiser. So, there could be photographs. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the absurdity finally overwhelmed me. Dad, the ceremony is on a military base. I know. And? Chloe thinks. He stopped, then forced the words out. She thinks your injury might become the story. My injury. Yes. The one I received serving my country. I know. And she'd rather people focused on her husband. He whispered. Yes. I closed my eyes. For years, I'd imagined this conversation happening differently. Maybe he'd apologize. Maybe he'd finally choose me. Instead, he sounded like an employee asking permission from his supervisor, not a father talking to his daughter. So you're not coming. He hesitated. I don't want to create problems. Problems. That's what I'd become. A problem. I understand. Sarah, no. My voice remained calm. I really do. I ended the call. 10 minutes later, Mom called. Unlike Dad, she didn't sound guilty. She sounded annoyed. It's only a medal. I stared through the apartment window. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Do you know what the Purple Heart is? She sighed dramatically. I know exactly what it is. Then why call it only a medal? Because life moves on. She sounded impatient. You survived. That's what matters. I swallowed. I almost didn't. But you did. Another pause. So stop acting like this is some life-changing event. I looked down at my damaged arm. It already was. She never answered. Instead, she repeated the same words she'd used before. Don't embarrass your sister. Click. I didn't move for several minutes. Eventually, David walked in. He took one look at my face. They backed out. I nodded. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked, "What do you want?" Not, "What should you do?" Not, "What's the right decision?" Simply, "What do you want?" I answered honestly. I don't want to walk onto that stage alone. David stared at me for a second, then stood. Come on. Where? You'll see. 45 minutes later, we pulled into the woodworking shop. Thomas was finishing a large walnut display case. The smell of fresh sawdust filled the building. He looked up as we entered. Something in my face must have told him everything. He shut off the sander, removed his safety glasses, walked toward me. What happened? My parents aren't coming. He waited. They chose my sister. Again. Thomas didn't ask why. He didn't ask whether I'd tried harder. He didn't offer one meaningless sentence about forgiveness. Instead, he folded the shop rag in his hands, looked directly into my eyes. When's the ceremony? Saturday. What time? 1 o'clock. He nodded once, then said 6 words I'll remember for the rest of my life. I'll be standing beside you. That was it. No hesitation, no conditions, no obligation, just certainty. Something inside my chest finally gave way. Not because my parents had abandoned me. I'd lived with that for years. Because for the first time, someone had chosen me without being asked twice. The following afternoon, as I was pressing my dress uniform, my phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. 9 unread messages, every one of them from Chloe. Apparently, she'd learned someone else would be accompanying me. Who is it? Don't make this into a spectacle. Julian doesn't need more headlines. You're embarrassing the family. I read every message, then quietly turned the phone face down. For the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in defending myself. Because 48 hours from now, the entire room was about to learn something my parents never had. Family isn't always the people who raise you. Sometimes, it's the people who refuse to let you stand alone. Saturday arrived before sunrise. I woke up at 5. Not because I had set an alarm, because I'd barely slept. The apartment was silent. Outside, the first hint of daylight stretched across the parking lot. I brewed a pot of black coffee. No breakfast. I wasn't hungry. I stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at my dress uniform hanging from the closet door. Every ribbon sat perfectly straight. Every brass button reflected the morning light. Today, one more medal would be added. The only question left was whether I'd walk onto that stage feeling abandoned or surrounded by people who had earned the right to call themselves family. At 11 o'clock, David knocked on my door. He wasn't alone. Thomas stood beside him wearing his army dress blues. For a brief second, I forgot how to breathe. I'd never seen him in uniform before. The rows of ribbons across his chest caught the sunlight. Combat badges, campaign medals, years of service, decades of sacrifice. He looked less like an old woodworker and more like the soldier he'd spent a lifetime becoming. He adjusted my collar without saying a word, then stepped back. There. I smiled. You inspect everyone this carefully? Only the ones representing the family. Those words settled somewhere deep inside me. Family. He never used the word casually. The auditorium was already filling when we arrived. Rows of soldiers sat in perfect formation. Families whispered quietly while finding their seats. Children stared wide-eyed at the uniforms. The army band tuned their instruments near the stage. Everything felt orderly, steady, predictable, exactly the way military ceremonies should. I waited behind the curtain with several other recipients. One soldier beside me adjusted his tie for the 5th time. Another kept rubbing his wedding ring. Everyone was nervous, not because of the medals, because of the people watching. I glanced through a narrow gap in the curtain. Then I saw them. Row 20. My parents. Chloe. Julian. All 4 had come after all. Apparently, someone had informed them that a 3-star general, the mayor, and several state officials would be attending. Suddenly, the ceremony had become important enough. Mom wore a bright designer dress that looked completely out of place inside a military auditorium. Dad sat stiffly with both hands folded together. Chloe scanned the room constantly, always watching, always calculating. Julian smiled at anyone who made eye contact. Campaign mode. Even here. For just a second, the old anger tried to return. Then Thomas placed one hand lightly on my shoulder. You don't have to carry that today. I looked up. No? He shook his head. Today is about what you earned. Nothing else. The weight I'd been carrying for years suddenly felt lighter. The band stopped playing. The room fell silent. The commanding general stepped to the podium. He welcomed everyone, spoke about sacrifice, duty, service. Then he began calling names. One by one, soldiers crossed the stage. Families joined them. Parents, spouses, children. Each medal carried its own story. Each scar belonged to someone different. Finally, the general looked down at the final card. Staff Sergeant Sarah Marsh. I stepped onto the stage. My shoes struck the polished wood with sharp, deliberate echoes. I stopped exactly where instructed, came to attention. The auditorium disappeared. Training took over. For a few seconds, nothing existed except the uniform and the flag behind the podium. The general looked toward the audience. Who will stand as Staff Sergeant Marsh's family representative? Silence. I heard movement from the back rows. Dad shifted forward. Mom looked toward him. Neither stood. Neither moved. Years ago, that hesitation would have broken me. Today, it simply confirmed what I already knew. Then, heavy footsteps echoed from the front row. Thomas Vance stood. Every soldier in the room recognized the rank on his sleeves before he reached the aisle. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. He climbed the stairs slowly, not because of age, because every step carried purpose. He stopped beside me. The general smiled. And you are? Thomas answered without hesitation. Her family. 3 simple words. Yet somehow, they carried more love than anything my parents had said in 32 years. The general looked at Thomas for a long moment, then nodded. I believe that's exactly the right answer. He opened the presentation case, lifted the Purple Heart. Before pinning it to my uniform, he leaned closer so only I could hear. You earned this. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. I swallowed hard. Yes, sir. The medal settled over my heart. Its weight surprised me. Not because it was heavy, because everything it represented suddenly became real. The general stepped back, raised his hand in salute. I returned it. A command echoed across the auditorium. "Present arms!" More than 200 soldiers moved in perfect unison. The sound of boots striking the floor shook the room. Every right hand snapped upward. Every eye remained fixed forward. No applause, no cheering, only respect. Pure, undeniable. I lowered my salute, almost without thinking. I looked toward row 20. Dad's face had gone completely pale. Mom stared at Thomas as though she couldn't understand what she was seeing. Chloe no longer looked confident. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the center of the room, and there wasn't a single thing she could do about it. The reception afterward felt completely different. People weren't interested in politics. They wanted stories. Veterans stopped to shake my hand. Young soldiers thanked Thomas for his years of service. Families introduced themselves. No one asked who my father was. No one cared what Julian did for a living. Status meant nothing inside those walls. Character meant everything. I realized then I'd spent my entire childhood chasing acceptance from people who valued appearances. Now I stood among people who valued sacrifice. The difference was impossible to ignore. A little later, Thomas was asked to say a few words. He walked to the microphone. The room became quiet. He rested both hands on the podium. "I've spent over 40 years wearing this uniform." His voice was calm. "I've seen brave men. I've buried brave men. I've also learned something." He looked directly toward the audience. "The strongest soldiers aren't always the ones who come home without scars." He paused. "They're the ones who refuse to let those scars define who they become." Then he turned toward me. "Sarah Marsh built bridges under fire. She carried others before herself. And today, I'm proud to stand beside her." No elaborate speech, no dramatic performance, just the truth. When the applause filled the room, I wasn't looking at the crowd. I was looking at the man who had given me something I'd spent my entire life searching for. Not approval. Belonging. I didn't realize it then, but the hardest conversation of my life was still waiting for me. Because before the day ended, my father would finally walk toward me. And for the first time, he wouldn't be able to hide behind anyone else. The reception lasted nearly an hour. People drifted between tables. Coffee, cake, quiet conversations. Veterans exchanged stories only other veterans could understand. Children asked to take photographs with soldiers. The atmosphere felt warm, peaceful. For the first time that day, I relaxed. Thomas was laughing with 2 retired sergeants when I noticed someone approaching from across the room. Dad. He wasn't walking with the confidence I'd always associated with him. His shoulders seemed lower, his steps slower. He stopped a few feet away. Neither of us spoke. For several uncomfortable seconds, we simply looked at one another. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Congratulations." I nodded politely. "Thank you." Another silence. He searched for words. "I didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" "What this medal meant." I looked around the room. "You could have asked." He lowered his eyes. "I suppose I could have." He glanced toward Thomas. "I've never seen someone speak about you like that." I followed his gaze. Thomas was helping a young corporal adjust his dress jacket, smiling, listening, treating him with the same quiet respect he'd shown me. Dad spoke again. I don't think anyone's ever looked at me that way. His voice sounded older somehow, less certain, less proud. I realized something. For decades, my father had chased admiration. Thomas had simply earned it. Those are very different things. I'm sorry. The words came so quietly, I almost missed them. I stared at him. In 32 years, I'd imagined hearing those words hundreds of times. I'd pictured dramatic apologies, tears, regret. Instead, they arrived softly, almost awkwardly. I failed you. He swallowed. I kept choosing what looked successful instead of seeing what actually mattered. I believed he meant it. That didn't erase the past, but it mattered. Before I could answer, Mom appeared beside him. She looked uncomfortable, like someone attending the wrong event. She glanced briefly toward my medal, then toward Thomas. I didn't know. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I never understood. I smiled sadly. No. You didn't. She looked down. I thought protecting Chloe meant protecting the family. And instead, she stopped. I pushed part of my family away. There wasn't an excuse hidden inside those words, only exhaustion. A few moments later, Chloe walked over. Julian stayed behind. Probably for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about cameras. She looked tired, older, smaller somehow. I owe you an apology. I waited. When your article appeared, I called Dad. I told him it would hurt Julian. I asked him to make it disappear. She laughed bitterly. I actually believed your military service was competing with my life. She shook her head. What kind of sister thinks like that? One raised to believe love was something you competed for. I didn't say it aloud. She already knew. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. She looked directly at me. I just wanted you to hear me say, I was wrong. For the first time, there were no excuses, no politics, no blame, only truth. And strangely, that was enough. Thomas walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked from me to my parents, then quietly handed 1 cup to Dad. Dad accepted it with surprised eyes. You raised an extraordinary daughter, Thomas said. No, Dad answered. His voice cracked. I raised a little girl. The army, he looked at me, and people like you, helped her become the woman standing here. Thomas smiled. No, she did that herself. Months passed. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. I returned to duty. Physical therapy finally ended. The scar remained. It always would. But I stopped hiding it beneath long sleeves. Whenever young soldiers asked about it, I told them the truth. It's proof that healing isn't the same thing as forgetting. They usually understood. Back in Connecticut, things changed slowly. Not perfectly, but honestly. Dad retired from banking earlier than expected. Instead of joining another corporate board, he started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped veterans transition into civilian careers. The first time I visited, I watched him spend 20 minutes listening to a young Marine talk about job interviews. Not interrupting, not advising, just listening. I smiled. That would have been impossible years earlier. Mom surprised everyone. She sold several pieces of expensive artwork that had decorated the house for decades. With the money, she helped fund scholarships for military families in our county. When reporters asked why, she didn't mention Chloe. She didn't mention politics. She simply answered, "Because I spent too many years valuing appearances over sacrifice." It was the most honest sentence I'd ever heard her speak. Chloe's life changed too. Julian eventually won another election, but she stopped managing every headline, stopped worrying about perfect photographs. One Saturday, she drove 3 hours just to attend a charity build at Thomas's woodworking shop. She spent the afternoon sanding boards beside veterans she'd never met. At the end of the day, she looked at me. "I think this is the first thing I've ever done that nobody will post online." We both laughed. It felt normal, like sisters. Maybe for the first time. As for Thomas, nothing really changed. He still opened the woodworking shop every morning before sunrise, still carved American flags from reclaimed lumber, still pretended not to notice whenever I arrived with fresh coffee. One afternoon, he handed me a small wooden display case. Inside rested my Purple Heart. The back panel looked familiar. I turned it over. It had been built from reclaimed cedar. "You recognize it?" I ran my fingers across the grain. "It came from an old backyard fence." He smiled. David told me the story. The wood wasn't identical to my childhood bunker, but it didn't need to be. Some things aren't rebuilt by replacing what was lost. They're rebuilt by giving old pain a new purpose. A year after the ceremony, the Army invited me to speak at a leadership conference for newly promoted officers. I stood behind the podium wearing the same uniform, the same medal, the same scar. I looked across the room and asked one question. "How many of you believe leadership begins with authority?" Several hands went up. I smiled. "It doesn't. It begins with choosing someone when they believe nobody else will." I paused, thinking about Thomas, thinking about David, thinking about a frightened 14-year-old girl sitting alone inside a wooden bunker. The greatest leaders I've ever known weren't the loudest. They were the people who quietly stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. That evening, I drove to Thomas's shop. The sun was setting behind the trees. Golden light spilled through the open doors. He was sanding another piece of cedar. Without looking up, he asked, "How'd the speech go?" I smiled. "I borrowed something from you." "Oh?" I nodded. "I told them leadership begins by choosing people." He chuckled. "Sounds smarter than anything I'd say." "It was your lesson." He shrugged. "I just happened to say it first." Sometimes people ask whether receiving the Purple Heart was the proudest day of my life. They're always surprised by my answer. The medal mattered. Of course it did. But the moment I'll remember forever wasn't when the general pinned it to my uniform. It wasn't the salute, or the applause, or even hearing my name called. It was one quiet moment when an old soldier walked across the stage, looked an entire room in the eye, and answered a simple question with 3 words: her family. That was the day I finally understood something I'd been searching for since childhood. Family isn't defined by the people who share your last name. It's defined by the people who show up, stay, and never make you earn the love they freely choose to give. And in the end, that became the greatest honor I ever received.